Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you very much for coming. Now I've lost my, I can not see the screen, so now someone has to come and help me and get my presentation. So yes, so I'm going to give you a slight historical background on the Kindertransport. As Ursula already said, what we call the Kindertransport is the rescue of nearly 10,000 unaccompanied minors with a Jewish background. I emphasize this with the Jewish background because the children were not all Jewish. Most of them were considered Jewish according to the race laws of the National Socialists, but they wouldn't have necessarily, or their families wouldn't have necessarily defined themselves as Jewish. So that's a sort of one complicated aspect of the Kindertransport already, because most people think of them as Jewish children, but that is much more complicated. They came from Austria, Czechoslovakia, Germany, and Poland, but again that's slightly complicated because the borders of course changed at that time. Now the Kindertransport was initiated in Britain after the November pogroms in 1938, and it was the public pressure from the public in the UK on the British government that really got them going, got them to do something. The Home Secretary at the time apparently once said in a committee meeting, this is verified, we have to be seen to be doing something. So there was not a great desire necessarily from the government's point of view. I mean, obviously, government, different parts, there were MPs who were very active, but others were not so active. There wasn't a great desire from the government point of view to do something, but the British public put pressure on the government. The children were between 2 and 17, and they arrived between December 38 and September 39, the outbreak of the Second World War. It was organized on the German, Austrian, Czech part by organizations in those countries, Jewish organizations really, who organized the putting together of lists of children ready for emigration. So the parents had to decide that they wanted their children to emigrate on their own, and then had to put them on the list. There's one memoir where a child says that she herself put herself on the list. I don't know whether this is likely, because there was actually quite a bureaucratic element to it. You had to bring various forms of identification, so it wasn't something spontaneous at all. So once the children were on the list, then they had to get accepted, and then when they arrived in the UK, some of them were first accommodated in holding camps, but mainly later most of them were accommodated in foster families and in children's homes, and some of them also in boarding schools. So the question really is, why are we still talking about this now? Now, of course, you can talk about any historic period at any time, but as we all know, the issue of refugees is a current one. It probably has always been, they've always been refugees, but it has come to the forefront again of the public attention in the last 2 years or so. Here you see an extract from a Guardian article which was published in 2016, and I'm sure you also have all heard of it. Lord Alf Dubs, he tabled the so-called Dubs Amendment, and he, in this Guardian article, is called the Labour peer who came to Britain as part of the government-backed Kindertransport. The Dubs Amendment asked for unaccompanied Syrian child refugees to be admitted to the UK, and actually, I'm not sure this is possibly wrong, I'll rephrase it, asked for unaccompanied child refugees to come to the UK. They didn't have to be Syrian. So that's what Lord Dubs did. So we are still talking, so in relation to the current so-called refugee crisis, we're talking about the Kindertransport more. Now, even the Guardian calls the Kindertransport a government-backed scheme. Now, this is only partially true. It is true in as much that as the government waived the visa requirements for the Kindertransportees, for these 10,000 child refugees. So if you see that, that document, and this is the sort of document we also have on the title page of Ruth's book. This is the document that the Kindertransportees had to have, and here in the middle you can read this document requires no visa. So everybody else who wanted to come to the UK at the time had to have a visa. Adults had to have a visa, but these child refugees didn't have to have a visa. Government backed, though, in as far as finance is concerned, that was not the case. The government did not fund the Kindertransport. The Kindertransport was largely funded due to public donations. All the Kindertransportees had to have a so-called guarantee of £50, and this had to be fundraised, and this was fundraised from private individuals and also from sort of groups that fundraised this money. And also, and there had to be funds for accommodating the children and actually for bringing them over. So in that respect, the UK government did not back the Kindertransport. They were not willing to finance it. So what I want to sort of briefly tell you about is the debates that are still being discussed amongst academics and also amongst former refugees relating to the Kindertransport. And one of the questions, of course, refers to the Kinder, the children of the children's transport. Why were only child refugees admitted? Godela called the Kindertransport an amazing rescue, and it is, because if we now think, we would suggest to the British government or the British public that we would take in 10,000 children within 10 months, people would probably think, ooh, can't do that. And that is exactly what happened in 38, 39. On the other hand, the conditions of care were not what we now would accept as acceptable, of an acceptable standard. The matching between foster families and children, the way children were distributed, there were many aspects that really were not adequate. Other debates, of course, now in the 21st century relate to what happened at the end of the war. The children didn't sort of suddenly change at the end of 1945. A lot happened in 1945, and Ruth and Ursula will talk about this in this specific case as well. So post-war lives are also important. And then we talk about commemoration, of course, and that again relates to things like novels, but also public monuments and memorials. Why only children? What you can see here is a picture of a Syrian boy on Brighton Beach, actually, and it is a picture that is on the first page of a UNHCR report about the Syrian refugee resettlement program. And actually this brochure is very interesting. I've looked at it, and most of the pictures of refugees in this brochure are of refugee children. And the program is not about children, it's about whole families. So clearly, why only children? Children are possibly perceived less threatening. We have an emotive response to children, where most people love children, and obviously he's incredibly cute. Everybody, amazing, isn't it? And that sort of response, and that is something within Kindertransport research we talk quite a lot. Because obviously there is a reason why this sort of aspect has come to the forefront of the public and the academic attention. But it also has led to a division between refugees that are considered more desirable than others. Because really, everybody deserves to live, everybody deserves to have a safe life, whether you're old, young, male, female, or a child. And of course, that is something sort of to bear in mind, and there were quite some unedifying sort of media reports about when some child refugees from Calais came over, then they were deemed to look too old. So that's one of the debates. The other debate, I've already said, is about conditions of care. The idealized image of the Kindertransport, this is a picture of two young children on the Kindertransport in 1939, and the reality. It wasn't all smiling, sort of happy. It was very, very difficult. And we can all imagine the difficulty in settling in, the linguistic difficulties, the mismatch between foster families and children according to religious observance, for example, or cultural habits. It was very, very difficult, and we have to bear that in mind. And it goes as far as in some very tragic cases where children were abused in their foster families. How do we know about the Kindertransport? Memoirs are very, very important, and I'm showing you 2 memoirs here, and of course Ruth will talk about her memoir. And again, memoirs are personal experience, but they are written in a social context. They change over time. For example, Ruth David, there's an English language version and German language version of the memoir. They're actually slightly different because they were published at different times. That's something we need to bear in mind. Research on post-war lives. Well, I'll just give you an example. Godler said, I'm from Aberystwyth University. This is a picture of a Kindertransportee called William Dienemann, formerly Wolfgang Dienemann, and he came as a boy aged 9, and later he became the university librarian at Aberystwyth University. So we have to bear in mind that the Kindertransport, it sometimes looks like it was mainly focused on London, that refugees mainly settled in London, but no, they did settle all over the UK. They took up all sorts of jobs, had families. We are talking about a lot of individual lives, and that is also something that we should bear in mind, that there's no such thing as a typical Kindertransport story. Really, there are Kindertransport stories in the program. Last, I will finish with Kindertransport commemoration. Within the public British discourse, the Kindertransport is quite at the forefront. Really, it is more discussed than other groups of refugees. And maybe I will leave you with this question: is the Kindertransport maybe sometimes instrumentalized as this sort of idealized image of refugees? I will leave you to ponder that yourselves. But that is really something that we talk about much more now than we have done before, and that I think also has something to do with the refugees arriving these days and how they are accepted in British society. So thank you very much. I'll hand over to Ruth now.
Can you hear me at the back? I would rather not.
It makes me feel as though we're comparing things.
I hate this. It feels as though I'm supposed to sing a song. Do I have to use it?
Can you hear me without?
You could sing a song, we don't mind.
My husband's the singer, not me. Seeing that memorial in Liverpool Street Station on the screen, much as I like it and appreciate it, much better in my opinion is the commemoration at the back of Friedrichstrasse station in Berlin, where there are 2 groups of children facing in different directions. The caption of one is "Trains to Life." The caption on the other is "Trains to Death." And that is hugely moving. I just want to add a couple of things to the brilliant presentation that Andrea's given. One that has been recently researched and encapsulated in a feature-length new film about Wilfred Israel that is going to be shown in London on Sunday at Regent Street Cinema. I've seen it in Manchester. It's absolutely brilliant. It's called Wilfrid Israel, The Essential Link. And the essential link is that Wilfrid Israel came to London from Berlin and lobbied contacts he had in London, in Parliament, and set the whole thing going towards the Kindertransport, which he then organised and paid for the trains, together with Frank Foley, a British spy, in Berlin. And they are my rescuers because I came from Berlin. The second thing I wanted to add was I talk in schools. I actually talk with any audience, any group that invites me, anywhere in the country and in Germany too, but mainly in schools, and I describe to the school children what it feels like to be a refugee. I tell them that it feels as though somebody has suddenly ripped away the whole of the world you knew, like a carpet from under your feet, and you find yourself floundering in a world that feels totally mad and makes no sense at all, because you can't understand anybody, because they all speak a strange, different language. And that is what refugees, especially children today, are experiencing. And do we feel proud of that, or are we going to do something about it? That's what I challenge children with. Now, I'm supposed to be telling you about my experience, and if you want to know my Kindertransport experience, it's all in this book. I hate this thing. All in this book, which you can get on the internet. So I'm not going to go through that, because shortly somebody will shut me up. I will add to this. My story goes on long after this book, what I've written in this book, because fantastic things have happened since, and quite recently. Triggered off by Ursula Krechel's novel, which she will tell you about later on. At first, when one of my contacts in Germany told me about the novel, I was absolutely gobsmacked. Why hadn't I heard about it before? Of course I ordered it immediately. I was told that it was the story of my father. And when I read it, I approached it in not very good faith. I was angry. But as I read it, more and more, I really appreciated it. It is a brilliant novel that brings to life what my father suffered after the war. Not just what he suffered before the war began and during the war in Shanghai, but afterwards. The more I read it, the more I appreciated this. And then when Zweite Deutsche Fernsehen commissioned a film, again I was gobsmacked. But I've left out the novel made me realise how little of my father's story I knew, how little I knew about my parents. Because when we were reunited after the war, a 10-year gap could not be breached. The difference between a 4-year-old that I was when I came on the Kindertransport And the 14-year-old I was, in 1949, repatriated against my will to Germany. Couldn't work. We couldn't talk to each other. The past was too raw and frightening to open up. And we kept it that way. We got to know each other. You can't pick up a relationship after 10 years. You have to forge a new relationship. We did. We had a lovely time together. We could talk about anything as long as no one mentioned the past. If you cut off a huge chunk of your life, you're not a whole person. For 50 years after I came to England, I tried to cut off my roots. I had nothing to do with Germany, even though I was going to Germany several times a year because I had to. That was my promise to my parents, to be allowed to come back to England. When I was in England, I had nothing to do with Germany. Bertha Leverton's reunion of the Kindertransport, the 50th anniversary of our coming over, I was 54. I realised I was strong enough. I had a good marriage, 3 adolescent children, a good career as a teacher. I had my self-esteem and my trust in people back. I was ready to reclaim my past. Then, when Ursula Krechel's novel came out, I realised that I had still more to learn, because I had to find out what was fact and what was fiction. And I went to the court in Berlin to verify, did my father actually work there before the war? He never talked about it. They had read the novel and they welcomed me. And they decided to research the real story of my father. And they organised a wonderful event in his honour in the court where he was frog-marched out by the Nazis. And that really gave him, together with the novel, that event gave my father the what I call posthumous literary justice. And I think justice is enormously important. Punishment is not justice. Knowing the truth, having the truth out in the public sphere is what I call justice. And the novel and the film, to a certain extent, have brought a universal story. Using my family as an actual family, it has brought universal truths into the public domain that I really, really appreciate. Now, because both the novel and the film of the novel are fiction, I was invited to Germany to present my book, this one, newly translated into German, to 3 German audiences. And they were whopping audiences because they'd all seen the film recently. And they just wanted to talk about the film, what was fact and what was fiction. And I then decided that the real story, as far as I could tell it, must be out there too, as well as the fictionalized, more universal story. So I wrote a play of the real story of my family as far as I could possibly present it, because I challenge anybody to find a story that is totally factual without any fiction in it. You have to do a bit of guesswork, you have to do a bit of emphasis. My play is called What Price for Justice, and it's as much fact as I can manage. The idea came from my son, Barry, he was watching the film of Landgericht, and he said under his breath, this would go very well on the stage. He's an amateur actor and director. So I stopped the film and I said to him, are you serious? He said, yes, I am. So I said, right, I'll write the play, you put it on the stage. And he is putting it on the stage with his amateur drama group in May next year in Liverpool. And there will be a matinee on Sunday, I think it's the 13th of May, so that anybody from London will be able to get there and get home again. More details if you want from me. So my story is still developing. I was pretty traumatized, so were every one of my family. I think my mother most of all. She has never been able to talk about what she actually experienced in Berlin before the war started and during the war. She survived the war in Germany, as the novel and the film tell. But my father, brother and I were also deeply traumatized. It takes a lot of hard work to get over the trauma. With just about the right sort of help at the right time, and particularly my husband's endless patience, I managed to get my trust in people back. And now I do what I can to bring these universal stories to light. I talk with any group that invites me, and I'm pretty much driven to do so because I live permanently with 1.5 million children who weren't rescued and who were murdered by the Nazis. And I cannot get over the feeling that is always there. One of those children who didn't make it might have been a brilliant musician, a brilliant parliamentarian, a brilliant scientist, and made much better use of the chance than I ever can. So I do my bit. And I speak and write books to challenge people to think. I don't want to tell anybody what to think. I want everybody to think more than they're in the habit of thinking. Because I believe the solutions to the dire world problems, if enough people talk together, share ideas, think together, solutions, potential solutions will emerge. And that's why I'm keen to challenge and be challenged. I've written 2 other books. To challenge people about the really awful treatment of what people usually call gypsies, Roman travellers today, all over Europe. And this book, Love, Hate and Indifference, the slide into genocide. I think it is time that we took seriously the whole issue of genocide. And I find indifference a bigger problem than racism. Racism, when it's manifest, can be challenged. How do you wake people up out of indifference? Why have we allowed genocide after genocide since the Holocaust? Whilst we keep chanting never again, we're allowing it to happen. And we know when violence is escalating out of control, we can intervene if enough people are determined we shall do so. we can. I think I've probably said enough. I've donated this book to the Holocaust, the National Holocaust Centre in Laxton, Nottinghamshire. You can only get it from them or from me, because Amazon takes too much of the money, and I want all the money to go to the Holocaust Centre. And I've got a few leaflets that you can have if you're interested about the Holocaust Centre. Thank you.
Bear with me while I try and sort technology. Hello everybody, can you hear me? Yes. No?
Yes.
Right. Hands up if you can't hear me. No, okay, very good. Okay, as Gordon mentioned earlier, today we're looking at the way that the Kindertransport has been presented in different genres. So, the Kindertransport has been presented in fiction, in film and on stage. Such portrayals invite the question of genre. For example, how does the form of representation influence how the Kindertransport is portrayed? Such questions are not meant to challenge the authenticity of a text, but rather to allow us to consider the narrative and how it's transformed. So, as Gola mentioned, we're looking at 3 different forms of representation. So we've had memoir, a novel, and a TV adaptation. And to clarify the connection between the 3, the TV 2-part adaptation is based on Ursula Krechel's novel, which is inspired by documents relating to Ruth's family. So why is fictionalisation important? There is no doubt that personal testimony is hugely valuable, yet it is also important to secure their story in a fictionalised form for future generations. So we're going to start by looking at the memoir form, which can take shape in either an individual memoir or a collective group of memoirs, such as Ruth's own memoir that we've just heard about, and a collective effort as well. So, generally speaking, memoirs focus on one person's individual experience, their thoughts and their actions and feelings. The content of memoirs often focuses on childhood in Europe, the departure, various homes in the host country, wartime Britain, profession and post-war life. Now, these are very general characteristics, but quite a lot of memoirs do follow this form. Naturally, the structure of memoirs differs quite significantly when compared to fiction. Novels are often considerably longer than memoirs. The reader is taken on the protagonist's journey, and the narrative perspective is often limited to the protagonist's point of view. Now, this is the point of view of a child and not an adult. Fictionalizations also allow more flexibility, so that the linear chronology, which is often found in memoirs, can be distorted. Interestingly, many novels actually end at the point that the war ends, and so the later life of the kind is actually not depicted in a lot of fiction. Film or TV fictionalizations take advantage of filmic or cinematic devices such as sound, camera angles, lighting, you name it, the list goes on. And these devices are often used for dramatic effect and to create evocative images. Like many films, Landgericht was shown at prime time on one of German TV's most well-known broadcasting stations, EDF. This naturally attracted a much wider audience when compared to memoirs. Landgericht was tailored to its audience and clearly depicts the historical context of the Kindertransport. And it does this by using historical tropes and cliches, as seen here. So we have the Kornitzer family on the way to the train, and they're directly situated underneath swastika symbols and flags. We have anti-Jewish graffiti, and a depiction of 1930s Berlin wouldn't be the same without a bar. Many Kindertransport memoirs and fictionalizations thematise the loss of the family. Memoirs and novels convey the pain of separation by reflecting the internal thoughts and feelings of the kind at the moment of farewell. Instead, a filmic portrayal effectively conveys this pain through facial expressions and gestures. Now, as you watch this clip, it's also interesting to note the sound at the end, which mimics the sound of a train gathering pace, which builds tension.
Guten Morgen, Sie sind?
Sven und Georg kommen.
Sie sind ein bisschen spät. So. Deine Nummer ist die 126. Kannst du dir das merken? Ja? Und für dich die 127.
Schauen wir jetzt auf den Koffer.
In England kannst du endlich wieder zur Schule.
Liebe Eltern, Sie dürfen nicht mit auf den Bahnsteig. Wir bringen Ihre Kinder dahin. Bitte verabschieden Sie. Danach kommen bitte alle Kinder zu mir und wir gehen rüber an den Zug. Bitte nehmen Sie jetzt Abschied.
Komm her.
scene, the viewer gains a momentary insight into the lives of the other Kinder, so not just the one kind which is often seen in memoirs. Interestingly, both the Landgericht novel and the TV adaptation portray the parents' inner conflict of whether to let their children go or not. And we can also see that they return to their family home without their children. This perspective is not normally shown in memoirs, and it's not likely to be shown in fiction, as the plot normally follows the protagonist onto the train all the way to England. In this next scene, Zelma and Georg have reached their first home in England. Once again, the filmic portrayal allows the merging of voices and of time frames, and this creates a juxtaposition between old and new and lost and found.
Well, George, this is your room. Do you like it?
Look, that teddy's for you.
Selma, you come along with me.
Selma bleibt hier.
Come. It's lovely room. You'll enjoy it.
Liebe Selma, lieber Georg, wir freuen uns so, dass sich ein Ehepaar gefunden hat, das sich eurer annimmt. Seid bitte nett zu ihnen, damit sie euch gern haben können. Wir sind sehr stolz auf euch, weil ihr so tapfer seid.
In contrast to memoirs and novels, there is no commentary here on what Selma is thinking when she's lying in bed. The film allows the space for the viewer to empathise and imagine Selma's thoughts. And to some extent, the audience can then transpose themselves into Selma's position and question, is she scared of the dark? Is she scared of being alone? And it leaves this room for imagination. Whilst emotive, this on-screen portrayal of Selma perhaps lacks the emotional depth that is found in memoirs. For example, Ruth describes this episode as follows: I had to sleep in a room all alone, and I remember lying in the black nothingness and wondering in terror whether anything still existed and whether I was still alive. As the theme of this year's Being Human Festival is lost and found, it would be quite fitting to relate it to the Kindertransport experience. So what is lost and found as the Kindertransport is reimagined in different media and for different audiences? In memoirs, the survivor's voice is found along with anecdotes that are often lost in history books. The creative nature of novels allows the reader to find themselves within the narrative. Landgericht, the TV adaptation, does not show the internal thoughts of the characters to the extent of memoirs or fiction, but it does depict the bigger picture and a different perspective. On a final note, I would like to suggest that this generation's task is to engage with and to rework these fictionalizations so that the stories and lessons of the Kindertransport can be preserved and not lost. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation.
One might think spending several years on a novel is isolating and disturbing, but I don't feel that way. I spend a lot of time with the characters I invent or the figures I use from the 20th century history. I invite and invent these people to be in my novel. I mostly transform them or take them from a distant, dark and tragic past and put them right at the heart of a controversy. It would seem weird for you, the audience, if I said that we had meetings on what the characters should do, what they should speak and act in the next chapter. There is no authority when writing, nobody who wants to discuss our plans and motivations. It's just me. Working on the film adaptation of Landgericht was completely different. I was not a member of the crew. Novelists have to do their work, scriptwriters and directors too. Very rarely they come together. I was also deeply involved in a new novel which will be published next year. From the very beginning, many specialists discussed the project and tried to find ways to make it appeal to a TV audience whilst also reflecting my intentions. The different professional experiences and styles were important. My first 3 meetings with producers were very intense and encouraging. They told me that Landgericht seemed to be a classic subject matter, perfect for film. This was not what I had imagined, but they convinced me. A man who has a goal and who is fighting in the face of adversity, I think so, to achieve that goal is, frankly speaking, a film hero. He might be a cowboy, he might be a detective or a judge fighting for justice. The difficulties when adapting the novel into a film were immense. The novel has very few dialogues. The lack of communication between the husband, wife and the children is an important theme of the novel. The confrontation between the judge and his former Nazi colleagues whilst also dealing with ministry bureaucracy even more. However, the film dialogues needs characters who embody their inner conflicts. I met the scriptwriter several times. She wrote 8 versions of the script, which seems to be quite normal in film. We discussed 3 of them. I, on the other hand, never write more than 1 version. When I start writing a novel, I have it more or less finished in my head. The alterations I do make are mostly related to the rhythm of the language, never to the plot. The more I write and wait to start writing, the more I'm free to work on the poetic license. To put it simply, Landgericht is written in 3 sections, like a concert, each one with a different tempo and rhythm. First, the judge returned home from exile in Cuba, Konitzer's idealistic intention to build a new post-war society and his ambition to gain a prominent position in it. The reconciliation of the family and his reinstallation as a judge in a civil court are all in the narration. Second, the flashback to a normal, successful life in Berlin, which is destroyed when Konitzer, as a Jew, is forced to leave the court and becomes a victim of severe discrimination. The Kindertransport, Konitzer's difficult exile in Cuba, his confrontation with migrants, socialists and communists who, unlike him, have held clear anti-Nazi stances since 1933, and his love for Kaidat, which is unbearable and heartbreaking. A third, Konitzer's struggle with bureaucracy, as he becomes more and more isolated, ill, and faced with demands which cannot be met. The film begins in 1938 with the Kindertransport and follows the story. The scenes in Germany and the scenes in Great Britain
alternate regularly while the book stays in one place and situation for many pages at a time. Originally, the producers planned for the film to be in 3 parts, but the TV station, ZDF, didn't agree. It would cost too much, and the subject matter would be too heavy at 8 p.m. So many scenes in the second part are rather rushed. While the beginning of the film paints a beautiful epic picture, you have seen it before, the scenes in the second part do not fit together quite as well. The film changes the intention. The emphasis is on the family, not on the political situation. The subtitle is A Family Story. Before, another subtitle, The Family's Destiny, was on the cards, which I vehemently disliked and I protested heavily. Persecution is not a destiny. The Jews being murdered in Auschwitz was not destiny. When viewing the film for the first time, I noticed the importance of the locations. The minister's house is wonderful. The farmhouse kitchen, which I described meticulously in the book, is perfect. The scenes in the English countryside are spectacular too, though it is actually Czech. Konitza's letters, and he writes a lot of them, and the answers he receives are rarely quoted. The juxtaposition of the 2 writing styles is very important in the novel. When Konitza immigrates to Cuba, this helps him to get a greater understanding of the political anti-Semitism. We get a rather touristy look at Havana. I tried to make it as well as possible. Everyday culture and life in Cuba then was not so different from that of the South State culture. Traveling to the country with a coach seems like an idea straight out of the beginning of the century, not of the 50s, not of the 40s. There had been streetcars in Havana and many Art Deco houses too. Konitza is a soulful man. The law is his principle. This man would never write a diary, as he does in the film. After Pearl Harbor, every contact to Germany was disrupted. In the film, he writes to Claire. He's a character who keeps his feeling hidden behind his formality. But the film lacks this narration, which is easily put across to the audience in a chapter of a book. The end of the film reconciled the Konitza family at the mother's grave. In the novel, there's no burial. Konitza is as lonely there as he is in Cuba and in Mainz, where he first begins to restart his career after the war. He has to give up his Cuban daughter, who he only sees briefly, just like he has given up the children he lost after sending them to England. The epilogue. His son feels unable to do his father justice and honor him in a German reference book of the immigration, a very good book. It's in every library. It seems like an insult to his father. This epilogue, which needed a new, tiny but important role in the film, was skipped. It didn't fit into the concept of the family story. Konitza is dead. It might sound to you like I really dislike the film. This is not the case. The film had an audience of nearly 4 million viewers, and as right now, 100,000 books have been sold. Those numbers are extraordinary. Both have been immensely successful. The film is very emotional and makes the viewer pity the characters. I, on the other hand, try to tell this terrible story in a slim way. Too many emotions disturb literature. The readers empathize with the family anyway. They might also reflect the current refugee situation today. Thank you.